Hey everyone, it's Mr. Drake. Today's video is about the rise to national prominence and ultimately the presidency of Abraham Lincoln and the circumstances surrounding the 1860 election and how it was the final straw that led to the secession of the South and the start of the Civil War. First, a little background on Lincoln. He was born in Hardin County, Kentucky in 1809 in a log cabin, as the legend often relates. As a child, his father moved the family to Indiana first and then to Illinois. Lincoln said later in life that part of the reason for this was probably because of slavery. Kentucky was a slave state, whereas Indiana and Illinois were not, and his father detested slavery, and so that may have been part of the reason that they moved. And in reality, it was probably to look for better farmland and better markets for crops and stuff like that. As a young man, Abraham Lincoln did not really have a whole lot of formal education. He taught himself how to read. He did have some tutors here and there. He served in the militia in 1832 in a very brief skirmish in Illinois against Indians known as the Black Hawk War. He was part of the Illinois State Militia then. From 1834 to 1842, he served 4 successive terms in the Illinois House of Representatives as a Whig. He then, years later, served 1 term in the U.S. House of Representatives, again as a Whig for Illinois' 7th Congressional District. And he was a Whig sort of in the mold of Henry Clay. Early on in life, he supported the American system. He supported internal improvements and things like that. He opposed the expansion of slavery. He was not an abolitionist. He sort of was a free soiler in that regard. He just didn't want any new territories acquired by the United States to be open to slavery. In 1842, he had married Mary Todd. He had 4 sons. One of those, Robert Lincoln, lived into adulthood, and the last known descendant of Abraham Lincoln died in 1985. After he left the House of Representatives in 1849, he had not run for re-election in 1848. Lincoln returned back to Illinois and essentially became a country lawyer, but sort of remained involved in local politics. And then in 1854, he helped found the Republican Party, which was the remnants of the Whigs. The Whigs had sort of fallen apart after Zachary Taylor died in office, and then Franklin Pierce, who was a Democrat, gets elected in 1852. The Free Soilers, who I talked about a minute ago, who opposed the expansion of slavery, and then some Northern Democrats who were anti-slavery. So the Republican Party was kind of a hodgepodge of all of those things. And again, the party calls for the end to slavery's expansion, not the abolition of slavery. Even in the 1850s, the abolition advocated by people like William Lloyd Garrison or John Brown, some of those immediatists, that was still considered fairly extreme, and that was not really what the Republicans were all about. The first Republican candidate for president was John Fremont in 1856, who lost to the Democrat James Buchanan. Lincoln runs for Senate in 1858. He is nominated by the Republicans to be their candidate for the Illinois Senate seat, held by Stephen Douglas, who was a Northern Democrat. The reason this election became so famous is for the series of debates that came about as a result of it. Lincoln and Douglas traveled around the state of Illinois. They had basically one debate in each congressional district, and they mainly discussed or debated the expansion of slavery. Stephen Douglas, you may recall, if you're one of my students from your reading, was in favor of popular sovereignty, allowing each individual state newly admitted to the Union to decide whether or not they should have slavery, and that was the whole crux of the Kansas-Nebraska Act in 1854, which was sort of Stephen Douglas's brainchild. Lincoln, of course, opposed to the expansion of slavery. So these debates don't help Lincoln win. He loses the election. This is back when senators were still chosen by state legislators, and the legislature of Illinois was more Democrat than Republican, so he doesn't win. But it does get him some attention, both locally and eventually nationally, and sort of catapults Lincoln into the spotlight and makes him a leading voice for prohibiting slavery's expansion. Ultimately, the 1858 Senate race and the debates with Stephen Douglas made Lincoln so famous that he was able to garner the Republican nomination for president in 1860. 1860 was a pretty crowded year in the presidential election. There are four mainstream candidates that run. You have Abraham Lincoln, who's a Republican. You have Stephen Douglas, who's a Democrat. The Democratic Party in 1860 split over the issue of slavery, and so Southern Democrats actually walked out of the convention and nominated their own candidate, who was Vice President John Breckinridge, who's from Kentucky. So you have Douglas, who's like the Northern Democrat, and then you've got Breckinridge, who's the Southern Democrat. Then you've got another group, the Constitutional Union ticket, that's John Bell. Lincoln ends up winning this election, but how he wins it and the numbers and statistics behind his victory cause a lot of dissension. He won a majority of the electoral votes. He got 60% or so of those, but Lincoln only gets 40% of the popular vote in a pretty crowded field. You see there on the map that he sweeps the North and the relatively newly admitted states of Oregon and California out west, but he doesn't win anything in the South. As a matter of fact, Lincoln wasn't even on the ballot in 10 southern states. He was considered so repulsive for his views opposed to slavery and slavery's expansion that a lot of southern states didn't even include him as an option for people voting for president. But he wins the election anyway. And in many ways, this is the straw that breaks the camel's back and leads to the South beginning to break away from the Union and form the Confederacy. Because of his views on slavery, he's the only candidate of the four who is opposed to slavery's expansion and is seen as being sort of anti-South or pro-abolition, even though that really wasn't necessarily the case. He was the one candidate of the four that the South couldn't live with. They saw Lincoln's election as a sign that they were about to be radicalized, as historian Shelby Foote once put it, that they were going to be deprived of what they called their property, and they were going to be kind of taken in this more radical, progressive direction that they didn't really want to go in. And so this is where the South decides to kind of get off the bus and start the Civil War and the Confederacy. So that will do it for today. We'll talk a lot more about this in class if you're one of my students, and as always, feel free to ask if you have any questions. Cheers.